Chapter 9. The Original African Big Man. The celebrations began modestly enough. A card, a friendly letter, a personal call, a friendly drink together, such were the beginning of the birthday activities, the journalist Albert Port recalled years later. Family and close friends, the men in formal wear, the women in evening gowns, would then gather at the old executive mansion on November 29, usually around sundown. Most guests brought a bottle of some kind, which, for those in the know, meant a bottle of the president's favorite champagne. If the weather held, the party took place on the rooftop deck, as thousands of bats, denizens of the capital's ironwood trees, hungrily swooped for mosquitoes. If the weather was poor, the guests gathered below in the ornate but decaying Victorian ballroom. No one enjoyed the festivities more than the guest of honor himself. William Bacon Arot Shadrach Tubman, the short, cigar-chomping president with the big watery eyes behind thick black spectacles, was known as a bon vivant, raconteur, and backslapper who was never more comfortable than when surrounded by admirers. Less than a decade after his ascension to the presidency in 1944, Tubman's ambitions were already evident in his invite list. The circle of friends and associates widened, noted Port, one of the president's most vocal critics. Legislators, the diplomatic corps, and foreign businessmen all flocked to the old mansion on Broad Street in a frenzy medley to demonstrate their loyalty. In 1953, the legislature even passed a bill to make the president's birthday a national holiday, though Tubman refused to sign it. By the end of the decade, the birthday festivities had become an expensive traveling circus, as each county sought to outdo the others. Government workers, down to the lowliest elementary school teacher, had half a month's salary withheld to pay for the increasingly lavish gifts. In 1960, Bossa presented Tubman with a Chrysler. Maryland County, Tubman's home, followed up a year later with a yacht, and in 1962, Sinoway bought him an airplane. There was some dissent over the cost of these gifts. Sinoway County's entire annual budget in 1962 could not have been $100,000, and more over the levies. But the sycophantic press insisted that the generosity of Liberians toward their leader was spontaneous. Why are celebrants so determined to express their appreciation in a very loud and concrete manner? Why are the counties caught in the birthday swing to this dimension? The editors of Liberian Star enthused in 1965, in a special birthday supplement. To name but few, it is because under President Tubman's leadership vast programs have been successfully implemented for the overall development of the human, natural and economic resources of Liberia. He struck the rock and riches flowed, thus transforming the face of the country. The problem soon became what to give a president for life who had everything. A monument, a cultural center, and a military academy, all with Tubman's name engraved on them, were erected in his honor. In 1969, the citizens of Bomi Hills announced the ultimate accolade. For the old man's 76th birthday 2 years hence, they would build a new county seat and name it Tubmanburg. Every prominent citizen of the territory, the government-run Daily Listener noted, will build a home there. Was it a prediction or an order? It didn't matter. Tubman would never see the Bomi Hills plan come to fruition. In July 1971, Liberia's president for 27 years died in a London hospital following a prostate operation, with his head in the lap of his longtime bagman. "I went out of my head, I jumped in the street," Jimmy Burrell recalled in war-weary Monrovia a quarter-century later. "There is a crazy black man running between the cars," people said, and a policeman explained, "The man that died there, this is one of his boys." Burrell wasn't just grief-stricken, he was convinced that Tubman's death had not been accidental. Vice President Tolbert paid the doctor, a South African doctor, he remembered. "Tolbert say he has been VP for 19 years, why couldn't this man give up to let me take over?" In Monrovia in 1969, a different conspiracy theory was on the tongues of the city's elite, many of whom believed that nobody was responsible for Tubman's death but himself. A notorious womanizer, Tubman, the rumor mill had it, was not in London for prostate surgery but for monkey gland implants, a long-discredited faux virility treatment. Regardless of what happened in that London hospital, the only president most Liberians had ever known, who had presided over the country's greatest economic boom and whose imperious reign set an example that would be emulated by autocrats across the continent, was gone. There is no controversy surrounding Tubman's birth. He was born in 1895, in a two-story, zinc-roofed house in the Maryland County seat of Harper, 250 miles from Monrovia and with no road to get there. His pioneer lineage was solid, though not exceptional. Neither freeborn nor mulatto, Tubman would always pride himself on his dark complexion, His paternal grandparents were part of the second wave of emigrants, that of impoverished slaves freed specifically to go to Liberia. William and Sylvia Tubman, the former said to be a distant relative of the Underground Railroad conductor Harriet, had been manumitted by the will of Richard Tubman, a Georgia planter, and sailed to West Africa aboard the brig Baltimore, in 1837, along with 40 other freed persons. The Tubman family prospered, despite William's death in 1847. Sylvia raised 3 sons and saw them educated. One, Alexander, the future president's father, would join Liberia's elite. He became a successful merchant and a capable politician, rising to the position of Speaker of the Liberian House of Representatives. However, he was first and foremost a Methodist minister, and made sure his children feared both him and God. Religion permeated the family's life, as it did the lives of most settlers, but Alexander headed a notably austere household. William and his siblings read the Bible and prayed at 4 o'clock every morning. Tobacco and alcohol were banned from the Tubman residence, but so were mattresses, which Alexander believed would turn his children soft and lazy. Sundays, the only day the Tubman children were allowed to wear shoes, were set aside for church and Alexander's sermons. Like the rest of settler Liberia, Harper completely shut down on the Sabbath. 50 years later, a travel writer marooned in relatively cosmopolitan Monrovia on a Sunday would complain of a city surrendered to zealous evangelical inactivity, the silence being disturbed only by the chanting of hymns and the nostalgic quaver of harmoniums in mission halls. William's religiosity had a peculiar intensity to it. He developed a lifelong habit of praying naked and alone at moments of turmoil or indecision. Nevertheless, neither as a boy nor as a man did this genuine piety ever seem to interfere with his propensity for sensual indulgence. Like many Liberian men of his generation, Tubman would not have a problem reconciling deep Christian conviction with a disregard for the faith's more restrictive prescriptions, such as its insistence on monogamy. Tubman attended the Cape Palomas Seminary. There were virtually no public schools in Liberia until Tubman's own reign, through his elementary and high school years. Run by Methodist missionaries, it was, like most settler institutions, from another world, an old-fashioned American schoolhouse set down on the steamy, palm-fringed coast of Africa. Pupils sat quietly behind their desks, learning their Bible, Latin, and ancient history by rote. They learned little that was modern or practical, little that might prove useful in business and industry, a constant complaint of domestic and foreign pedagogical reformers then and since. And, of course, there was no thought to teach the pupils about African culture or the Grebo language spoken by the vast majority of Maryland's inhabitants. Tubman was a competent student, though more as a result of what one teacher recognized as his remarkable memory and less because of any innate intellectual curiosity. What his classmates remembered, however, was not Tubman in school but Tubman after school, sneaking past his father's bedroom door at night to attend Grebo dances or surrounded by friends and acolytes whom he was recruiting for some sort of mischief. That Tubman would embark on a law career after graduating from high school in 1913 was all but inevitable. Other than the ministry, which he briefly contemplated, there was no other option for an ambitious American boy. Settlers and natives, who followed their lead, sued each other, not to mention foreigners, constantly. I do not believe that any group in the world loves litigation more than Liberians. An American engineer, commissioned by Firestone to build a road on its Maryland rubber plantation, complained. A fight between 2 of my laborers over a shovel would end up in one of their courts with 20 or 30 more of my men summoned as witnesses. The loss in man-hours was appalling. Charles Johnson, the American sociologist dispatched to investigate the Fernando Poe scandal, counted no fewer than 100 lawyers in Monrovia, a city with fewer than 5,000 residents. The law not only promised steady work, but was one of the best ways into Liberian political circles, which could prove even more profitable. Indeed, in the early 20th century, with Liberia's vast natural resources still untouched and trade dominated by foreigners, a government position offered the only path to the columned man's and country plantation to which many if not most settlers aspired. And so Tubman apprenticed with a legal luminary in Harper and passed the bar in 1916, after which he quickly made a name for himself as an effective and empathetic advocate by taking on cases other lawyers would not, notably those involving poor and native clients. Meanwhile, Tubman began to rise through the ranks of the Maryland government at a pace that was possible only in a tiny society with few other qualified individuals, becoming a court recorder at 20, a collector of internal revenues at 21, and a county attorney at 23. He was soon noticed by the Liberian elite. On a visit to Maryland in 1920, President-elect Charles King was said to be so impressed by Tubman's oratory at a Masonic banquet that he instructed local true Whig Party officials to keep an eye on him, and whenever there is a political opening for young Tubman, bring him forward and I will support him. And so at 28, Tubman became the youngest senator in Liberian history and, despite his greenness, one of the nation's preeminent legislators. Anyone who wants to see the best Liberian senator, in action, an admiring colleague remarked, need only to visit the chamber during the Firestone concession bill debate and keep his eyes on the stocky, fast-walking and fast-talking senator from Maryland County as he ambles about the floor. A word here and there, a casual political arm around a recalcitrant shoulder, a brief companionable colloquy with some old-timers, and the result was that the bill glided through the Senate as though it was a motion for Christmas adjournment. While King's endorsement launched Tubman's political career, it also nearly ended it. The Fernando Po labor scandal that engulfed the government in the late 1920s compromised everyone associated with the administration. Tubman was doubly implicated, as one of King's protégés and as Allen Yancey's cousin. He had not helped his own cause when, out of family loyalty, he successfully defended Yancey against slave-trading charges before the Supreme Court. The national true Whig leadership, eager to demonstrate to a hostile and skeptical world that they planned to reform Liberia, in a rare decision withheld their endorsement for Tubman's re-election. But party leaders had misread the political mood in Maryland, where most of the Americo electorate viewed the League's charges against Yancey as racist calumny. The No Tubman, No Senator campaign in 1931 may have been the work of Tubman's supporters, or it may have been spontaneous. Whatever the case, it was successful. Polls were virtually shut down throughout the county, denying the true Whig nominee votes and cutting Maryland's representation in the Senate in half until Edwin Barkley, King's replacement, finally agreed to a special election 3 years later. But Barkley and the newly elected Tubman soon clashed. While King and Tubman were modernizers who agreed on the necessity of attracting foreign investment, Barkley represented an older form of Liberian politics, one that was distrustful of white outsiders and determined to preserve the nation's sovereignty and the economic prerogatives of the Americo-Liberian elite. He was also steeped, as a member of a Barbadian clan, in West Indian economic radicalism and racialist ideology that were inimical to King and Tubman's vision. Almost ascetic in his personal life, Barkley was aloof and cerebral, an outsider in the glad-handing world of true Whig Party politics and a stark contrast to Tubman. Thus when Barkley put Senator Tubman on the Supreme Court, much of the Monrovia political establishment understood it as an attempt to neutralize him. And when, in 1942, Barkley chose Tubman as his successor, many guessed that Barkley thought he could hold on to power by choosing a man who from his perspective was a buffoon and therefore could be manipulated. But Barkley would soon understand that there was a perceptive, ambitious mind behind Tubman's affable nature. American observers of Liberia in the mid-20th century tended to compare its politics to the South's. It was, in certain respects, a fair analogy. The true Whigs did bear a resemblance to the pre-civil rights-era Democratic Party, in that both parties ran their nominees virtually unopposed. The decisions are made in caucus, the elections are meaningless, a New York Times correspondent quoted a knowledgeable Liberian as saying. But the comparison went only so far, not only because of matters of race and racism but because of the smallness of Liberia's political class. To attain prominence in public life an ambitious young man had to depend either on being selected directly by the President of Liberia, wrote Clarence Simpson, Tubman's chief rival for the presidency in the early 1940s, or work his way up through the party machine. And public office opened every door in Liberian life. An individual enjoys a position of influence in a church, a business, a charitable organization, or a fraternal society, noted one American scholar, because he holds, or has held, office in the Liberian government or the true Whig Party. Participation in Liberian politics was synonymous with party membership. As Simpson recalled, "I don't even know whether I ever joined the true Whig Party, but my membership in it was taken for granted ever since I was old enough to vote." Even if one did not donate a few dollars, march in a parade, or put up a campaign poster, the convention the party held every 4 years was an inescapable part of national life. During the early part of Convention Week, the Maryland County Brass Band kept things in the city. Monrovia, lively by their mighty serenades, was how one paper described the days leading up to Tubman's formal nomination for president. But the whole thing culminated today in a vast demonstration of over 2,000 people, accompanied by 3 brass bands, carrying banners, representative of the several counties, all manifesting the mighty political force that the true Whig Party really is. It was a grand show, but ultimately meaningless. The real decisions were made long before the delegates arrived, in Monrovia's Masonic Lodge No. 1, where both Barclay and Tubman were members. Like so much else in settler culture, Masonry in Liberia was a 19th-century American artifact transplanted to Africa. As de Tocqueville famously recognized, antebellum America was an associative place, where weak state, frontier conditions, and relative isolation led people to form voluntary organizations for every purpose. The Masons, Good Templars, Oddfellows, and Elks all had lodges in Liberia, though because Liberia had few other institutions, they were even more central to national life than they were in America, providing insurance and undertaking services and, with their balls and banquets, the trappings of high society. And none among them was more prestigious or influential than the Masons. The order had a long history in the Black Republic. We know that a great many founders of our country were active members of the craft. Tubman himself once pronounced, and I consider, our Constitution as Masonry put into political form and practice. The future Chief Justice James Pierre put the same notion in simpler terms when he addressed the Order's annual convention in 1957. Liberia has been rightly called a Masonic country. Liberian Masonry was a mulatto enclave when such color distinctions mattered, before becoming a more inclusive but still exclusively Americo-Liberian institution by the turn of the 20th century. By Tubman's time, civilized natives could join, but only if they had the right connections, if, in other words, they had been adopted by one of Liberia's leading settler families. Foreigners and Liberians alike understood that the Masons ran the country. All the big government decisions were made at the Masons' secret meetings, a member of Monrovia's elite recalled. In court, the top lawyers would use Masonic signals to fix cases with the judges. Every major Americo-Liberian settlement had its temple. Monrovia's was a battleship-size edifice constructed in severe neo-federalist style that stood atop Snapper Hill, the highest point on Cape Mesurado. The building had a steel-framed eye, 10 feet in diameter, on its roof, which gazed down upon the city below. Ordinary citizens, particularly uneducated natives, feared the place, likening what went on inside to the practices of the long-outlawed leopard societies of the Liberian bush that sacrificed victims in secret rituals and devoured their hearts to, they believed, increase their power. When I was boy, we stayed, far away, from Monrovia's temple, at night, one Liberian, an adolescent in the 1970s, recalled years later. We know it was too much Americo-Liberian, witchcraft there. Tubman was a true Whig and a Mason, but instead of carrying on the traditions of his distinguished forebears, he helped transform Liberia into a nation of the world. He sided, despite his provincial upbringing, with the King faction in Monrovia, which understood that Liberia's future prosperity lay with the new U.S.-led, post-war free trade order. And he was aided by a booming world economy, rebuilding after depression and war, that needed Liberia's resources, which Tubman was only too happy to offer. An economic backwater when he came to power, Liberia by the end of his reign would be known as the Switzerland of West Africa. That the country's hinterland had some of the richest iron ore in the world had been known for a century or more. On his epic journey to Musardu in the 1860s, Benjamin Anderson came upon a deposit so pure that the road leading through it was a polished metal pathway, smoothed over by the constant treading of travelers, and, hardly treadable in the dries, when, it becomes so thoroughly heated. European mining companies had reached similar conclusions in the 1930s and 1940s but were dissuaded from involving themselves in Liberia, not so much by its lack of infrastructure as by its suspicious and hermetic ruling caste. What I feared most were not these costs, of building roads and railways, but the attitude of the Liberian government, a Dutch geologist remarked after the war. They seemed to be of the opinion that the iron ore mining was a most lucrative business and that this was a beautiful opportunity to line one's purse. The Barclay administration, ever suspicious of white outsiders, put up obstacle after obstacle to a potential deal. I am of the opinion, the miner concluded, that only an American enterprise will succeed, as only they can reckon with the collaboration of the Liberian authorities. Into the breach strode the entrepreneur Lansdale K. Christie, a charismatic 41-year-old who had been thrown out of West Point for disciplinary reasons and was heir to a Brooklyn garbage scow fortune. During the war, he served in the Belgian Congo, arranging the transport of ores, including secret shipments of uranium for the Manhattan Project. To get to the Congo, he often passed through the U.S. Army Air Corps' seaplane base at Fisherman's Lake, some 50 miles outside Monrovia, the key Allied transport hub in the South Atlantic. It was here, an old friend and aide reminisced, that Christie decided his future lay not in New York's trash but in Africa's soil. Just weeks before the Nazi surrender in Europe, Christie was in Monrovia, cash and concession agreement in hand. He understood the Liberian elite's suspicion of white outsiders, so he hired H. Lafayette Harmon, the capital's savviest political fixer. But it was Tubman's ambition that would make his enterprise a success. Tubman, who saw foreign investment as the best way to realize his big plans for the country, and for himself, eagerly reached an agreement with Christie that allowed the American to mine Liberia's iron ore and pay only 15 to 20 cents per ton to Tubman's government. Even Tubman's court biographer admitted a quarter-century later that the deal was a poor one for Liberia, as he calculated, at the end of 40 years Liberia would have sold the best ore at Bomi Hills for a bare $8 million. The agreement was signed in Christie's lawyer's offices in New York by Treasury Secretary William Dennis, and when word of it reached Liberia, protesters took to the streets of Monrovia, furious at what many viewed as a clear case of bribery. The other interpretation in circulation was that the newly installed and still economically inexperienced Tubman was a 20th-century Edmund Roy, the president who had been duped by London financiers in the 1870s. At the root of Liberian anger and distrust, however, was that Tubman had violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Constitution. No constitutional provisions were more zealously guarded than the reservation of citizenship for persons of African descent and the prohibition of land sales to foreigners. Tubman did not sell Christie land, but the 80-year lease he agreed to was a sale in all but name, as distasteful to contemporary Monrovia nationalists as the Firestone deal had been to their fathers. Tubman, the opposition press cried, was selling the country. Tubman himself would admit only a couple of years later that the deal was an unfavorable one. He decided to renegotiate it, but made clear that this signaled a recalibration, not an abandonment, of his economic philosophy. Years later, in a 1955 campaign speech, he named the philosophy the open door, and insisted that the country's traditional autarky, as well as the Monrovia elite's narrow, selfish, contracted and strangulating policy, that we could develop our nation by our own might, resources and knowledge were obsolete. I will never subscribe to such a supercilious, short-sighted, contracted and phobic policy, he proclaimed, that paralyzed industry and investment and kept the nation in poverty, suspicion, despair, commotion and turmoil. Among the old guard, the Christie deal and those that followed raised the old fears about loss of sovereignty and subjection to white outsiders, even though revenues from mining allowed Tubman to pay back the humiliating Firestone debt in 1951, years ahead of schedule. Any dissent would only have had the opposite of its intended effect, though. Tubman's fear of political opposition often determined his policy, so that when it came to business, he preferred outsiders because, as non-citizens, they were less of a political threat, their presence in the country depending on the good graces of the president. In the 1950s, he began handing out lucrative government contracts to foreign enterprises and the country's growing Lebanese expatriate community. Meanwhile, the money poured in, a trickle at first and then, by Liberian standards, a veritable flood. Between 1955 and 1964, foreigners invested more capital, over $300 million, in Liberia than they did in its previous century of existence. The government's annual budget grew from $1 million when Tubman took office in 1944 to more than $50 million in the late 1960s. Some of this new money served useful ends. Paved roads fanned out from the capital, though the tarmac on the principal highway ended at Tubman's country estate in Totota, and hundreds of primary and secondary schools were built. But prestige projects claimed much of it. By the early 60s, some $50 million had been spent on gleaming new public buildings in Monrovia, including a new capitol, National Bank headquarters, City Hall, and Seaside Executive Mansion for the president. $20 million in the making, the Dream Mansion, as Liberians called it, featured an atomic bomb shelter, an underground swimming pool, a private chapel, a trophy room, a cinema and, because of the uncertainty of the city's public utilities, its own emergency power plant, water supply and sewage system. As a correspondent for Time described it in 1964, Tubman's new home combines the comfort of a garish four-star hotel with the appearance of a department store the week before Christmas. Tubman was unapologetic. When his gadfly Albert Port complained about the $150,000 price tag of the new presidential yacht, which had been a birthday gift from the people of Maryland, Tubman characteristically shot back with a personal attack. Port was a grumbler who makes so little contribution to the resources of the country that he should be ashamed to talk about public expenditures and self-serving nationalist appeals. He noted how, as a Supreme Justice in 1939, he was forced to hitch a ride on an American ship to get from Maryland to Monrovia. "Do you mean to tell me," he recalled the captain asking him, "that your government has no means by which she can get officials to the seat of government except they are transported there by Some foreign ships? The yacht was not intended for his personal pleasure, Tubman reasoned, but as a sign of Liberia's dignity. Still, the president delivered, at least for those at the top of Liberian society. Liberia in the 1950s and early 1960s boasted the second highest economic growth rate of any nation in the world, behind only Japan. While the primary cause was the post-war boom in the international automobile industry's insatiable appetite for Liberia's rust-red iron ore and cheese wheels of latex, Tubman's economic policies did have a significant effect. Most of the profits went to foreigners, of course, but Monrovia's well-connected big men benefited as well, becoming the first truly rich people in the nation's history. While they were chauffeured in American sedans to desk jobs at foreign subsidiaries, their wives cruised the aisles at the White Rose supermarket, lured by advertisements boasting a fresh supply of goods from the U.S. Their children, in crisp school uniforms, attended private academies, knowing that even mediocre grades would lead to a government scholarship to a U.S. university. As a Scottish shipping manager recalled, the social life of expatriates and elites in Tubman's day was lovely: golf, picnics, and balls at the Ducor Hotel, itself a new, 10-story addition to the rising Monrovia skyline. But the new suburbs of Sincor and Congatown, where the elite put up their marble villas overlooking the Atlantic, were not representative of Liberian life. In the words of the New York Times correspondent Helene Cooper, scion of one of the most pedigreed settler families, rich parents raised their perfect family cosseted by well-paid servants, and protected from the ravages of West African squalor and poverty by central air conditioning, strategically placed coconut trees, and a private water well. The well-off had grown rich, but the poor remained poor. Tubman liked to tell a story about a day his father escaped near certain death. The event took place deep in the bush of Maryland County, in the 1870s, during yet another conflict with the Grebos over land, trade, and honor. The young Alexander was part of a contingent of militia sent to avenge the burning of the Americo settlement at Philadelphia, an event that had sent a stream of refugees, including the Barneses, Tubman's mother's family, into Harper. Outside the Grebo village of Ruckay, they were ambushed. Alexander's brother William was slain, his body, in one settler historian's breathless account, devoured, by tribesmen with cannibalistic tendencies. Distraught, Alexander fell behind his retreating company. Alone in the bush, he heard a voice from behind a bugbug hill, one of the towering termite mounds that dot the Liberian countryside. Alexander raised his gun only to realize that the voice was that of an old tribal acquaintance named Dine Wea. Wea urged him to flee, saying that the warriors in pursuit would do to him what they had done to his brother. So moved was Alexander by Wea's aid that he pledged himself and later his eldest son to Wea's family's care, to see that they do not suffer in any way. Nearly 100 years later, as President Tubman announced the beginning of a new era in settler-native relations, he recalled his father's words, "During your lifetime, I want you to do all you can to work for better understanding between the tribal people and the government, should ever an opportunity present itself." It was an affecting story, and parts of it might have even been true. Tubman never failed to remind his audiences that it had a moral. Members of his family had fought and died in battles with the natives, he would say, "So, if I now declare a new day, letting the dead past bury its dead, I fail to see why anyone should linger and cling to the past." By the time Tubman got the opportunity to fulfill his father's wishes, open warfare between civilized and tribal was confined to history. The last native conflict occurred a dozen years before Tubman took office. But the old tensions still existed. Pliant chiefs had been co-opted and recalcitrant ones unseated, and when these tactics failed, Monrovia had sent in district commissioners. These were often unsavory characters from the lowest ranks of settler society, who viewed extorting the natives as their just compensation for a hardship posting. Attempts to assimilate the natives had failed. Natives adopted by Americo families or educated at mission schools might gain a seat at the foot of the settlers' table and, through intermarriage or concubinage, a place in their bedrooms. But the number of adopted natives was small, and efforts to incorporate the masses by administrative fiat had been largely fruitless. The result was that settlers and natives shared a territory that on maps read Republic of Liberia, but little else. Like his predecessors, Tubman arrived in office promising change. Unlike his predecessors, he proceeded to enact meaningful reforms. He inaugurated executive councils, adopting the tribal custom of palaver, whereby chiefs heard and resolved the complaints of their subjects. He traveled to every corner of the country, the dearth of roads requiring him. His Secretary of Information and Cultural Affairs later wrote in a paid New York Times supplement celebrating Tubman's efforts to modernize and democratize Liberia, to risk, his life crossing swollen streams and rivers by means of swinging bridges made of wild vines or in frail dugouts. In 1954, tiring of hinterland travel, Tubman brought the chiefs to his home county of Maryland, launching the first in a series of national unification councils. During the 1955 council in Monrovia, he listed the accomplishments, schools, roads, health clinics, of his administration. There were more natives in government, he said, and less government in the lives of natives. I can recall how at my first Interior, Executive, Council you complained that district commissioners were unrestrained in their imposition of fines upon you and your people. He reminded the chiefs that for the most insignificant act your chiefs, wives and children were humiliated and imprisoned, that you were compelled to bury your manhood and bow down to them as though they were your masters and lords, instead of your public servants. Today those conditions do not exist anymore. Tubman called his efforts to bring 20th-century civilization to the hinterland and to incorporate natives into Liberia's body politic his unification policy. It culminated in the 1964 Unification Act, which finally put an end to the second-class citizenship of 98% of Liberia's population. The act reconfigured the hinterland territories as counties and granted their propertied residents suffrage. Interestingly, it went into effect the same year Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which buttressed and protected the citizenship of disenfranchised Southern blacks, including distant relations of Liberia's settler elite. But having the vote and being a member of the vast majority of a nation's population did not naturally result in equality or access to power and wealth. For what really mattered in Tubman's Liberia was the same thing that had always mattered in Liberia: family. The elite in Monrovia called themselves the Honorables, a term as redolent of the antebellum South as the plantation houses settler elites once built for themselves on their upcountry estates. The Honorables possessed wealth and privilege and further set themselves apart through formal speech and etiquette. They possessed a noblesse oblige forged in high church Protestantism and Masonic principle, which they honored just as their ancestors' masters in Tidewater, Virginia had once honored the chivalric code they lived by, that is to say, largely in the breach. The Honorables ran Liberia and, until Tubman's economic open door, they owned most of it as well. They occupied almost all high government posts, monopolized the best-paying managerial positions set aside by foreign firms for Liberian nationals, and took the best land for themselves. The roads that Tubman built to connect the coast to the hinterland were not plied only by market women, baskets propped high on their heads. The Honorables used them too, motoring to their rubber plantations, which they had carved out of native lands, not with the sword but with the help of Monrovia lawyers wielding pens and writs. Natives hoping to get ahead in Tubman's Liberia, just like ambitious individuals among the settler middle and lower classes, had to secure the patronage of an honorable. As a native born I should stay in Monrovia, one high school student explained to an American anthropologist in the late 1950s, and get acquainted with some of the honorables of my country, in other words for me to be recognized more than a man who is not acquainted with the nobles in Monrovia. Today I find things easier with me in Monrovia than with some of my comrades who are newly coming into the city. For young Liberians, the student one sat next to in class mattered more than what one learned. But education was a relatively new means for Liberian natives and lower-class settlers to establish a connection with an honorable family. The tried-and-true methods were more intimate. Taking in gifted native children as wards, Christianizing and civilizing them and granting them the all-important surname, had been a part of the settler ethos since the 19th century, and it was something many native parents sought for their children as well. Then there were the country wives. A few open-minded honorables formerly married natives. The father of Clarence Simpson, the man who challenged Tubman for the presidency in the 1940s, was a notable example. But many if not most honorable men established second households with native women on their plantations and farms up country, an echo of the master-slave liaisons of the Old South that were at the root of some of the honorable's own family trees. As one anthropologist noted, while the Christian ethic of marital fidelity is officially accepted, in practice fidelity on the part of the men is as little accepted among Liberians as among tribespeople. Tubman himself was known for fathering children with at least a half-dozen women, though most were of settler lineage. The diplomat George Padmore, in recalling his own young adulthood in an upriver Americo settlement and his decision to marry President Barclay's secretary, understood that country wives indicated power and station. He wrote in his memoirs that customs in Liberia at the time, the late 1930s, were that, Americo, farmers married an educated, upper-class settler, lady mainly to maintain a prestige with the civilized community, but, he could likewise have as many native or farm wives as he might find financially possible to support. Such behavior was expected and accepted by virtually all Liberians, Americos and natives alike. Acquiring such farm women was considered a big gesture to the local tribe people, impressing them of one's leadership ability. Liberia was hardly the antebellum South, where masters chose or were compelled to deny their parental connection to the light-skinned slaves in their household. Moreover, the illegitimate children of settler men and native women were often treated as wards, as one American visitor observed in the early 1960s. A woman of American origin but long naturalized and married to an Americo-Liberian, was the object of much criticism, he wrote, because she refused to take into her household any of her husband's outside children and in particular, a son of whom he was especially fond, whom he had legitimized, and whom he was educating at some expense. Her uncharitable behavior was usually ascribed to the fact that she had been born a foreigner, and had never learned Liberian ways. The honorable class was thus permeable. Wards, bastard offspring, and the legitimate offspring of formal settler native marriages for the most part joined it. Once you lived with the families, the native journalist and former ward James Wollo remarked years later, there was the possibility that you can marry into the families and, then, you were a part of them. Those who could trace their lineage back to the country's beginning still retained their status, however. I can remember a period when you had first and second class Americos, a Dutch aid worker who grew up in Liberia recalled, when you had pure Congos, a popular term for Americos, and sort of Congos. It was typical to see a Congo woman and Congo man and the man having other children who were also part of the family, as such, Congos, but sort of second-class Congos. Others spoke of a ceiling that kept half-castes and assimilated natives out of positions of real power in the government, the Whig Party, or the Masons. As the dissident journalist Tone Ray wrote just 4 years before the native coup in 1980, before any Liberian can occupy a high position of trust and responsibility in the government, his descent is usually investigated. The ruling clique continues to show hesitancy over whether a person of ethnic background should run for the presidency and the vice presidency, or be appointed to the cabinet and other high posts. Such investigations could turn up embarrassing secrets, even in the most prominent families. Traditionally, native wards, native wives, and mixed ancestry children adopted settler names and manners, removing themselves as far as possible from village and tribe. In a Liberian notion borrowed from America, these half-castes and adoptees tried passing as civilized. This deception was both easier and more difficult than it had been for the ancestors of some lighter-skinned honorables, though skin tone among the settlers varied greatly and appearance alone was not a giveaway. Americo settlements were tiny, intimate places where neighbors took notice of the dirt under the fingernails of someone trying to bury his or her past. By Tubman's time the term honorable had lost its rigidity. Where once even the most casual of visitors to Liberia could recognize the castes, now even anthropologists doing fieldwork in the country found it difficult to assess who was settler, who was tribal, and who was mixed. Liberians had a better sense, but for them, the old distinctions no longer seemed to matter so much. For natives, settler and civilized were essentially synonymous. And for all but the haughtiest of settlers, often the women, lineage had come to matter less than lifestyle. Prejudice against those who had tribal blood flowing in their veins was now expressed subtly, if at all. Prejudice against the assimilated? Recalled Eugene Cooper, a member of one of Liberia's most prestigious clans. Not in my experience but deep down there might have been. The changing attitudes toward the assimilated natives represented a second, though less fully realized, step in the Liberian elite's evolution toward greater inclusiveness, the first being the gradual disappearance of the color line between blacks and mulattoes in the post-Roy era of the late 19th century. Tubman himself was of two minds about the honorables. His unification policy was premised on the idea that the old Monrovia settler elite had to cede a measure of its power to the native majority or, at least, to its civilized cohort. Tubman saw that Africa was changing around Liberia, the anti-colonial winds of change that the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan spoke of to an unheeding South African parliament in 1960 were blowing through Monrovia as well. No longer, Tubman understood, could Liberia stake its legitimacy in its status as Africa's only black-run republic. The natives were getting restless. Just 3 years earlier, the defiant Kwame Nkrumah had led the nearby Gold Coast, renamed Ghana, out of the British Empire, the first black-ruled, sub-Saharan colony to liberate itself from European rule. Tubman detested Nkrumah's socialist ideas, his rhetoric of Third World solidarity, and his efforts to forge a unified African polity ruled from Accra. He tried to position himself within the new Organization of African Unity as the continent's elder statesman, steering the dozens of new leaders away from what he saw as Nkrumah's dangerous fantasies. Yet at home, he lectured his countrymen that Americo-Liberianism must be forgotten. But it was to be a selective forgetting. Tubman understood the demographics of Liberia as well as any member of the settler community, and knew that making possible the full equality of the natives would quickly bring an end to American privilege and rule. Despite his strong early record on native matters, Tubman did little in the end to challenge the America's stranglehold on the government, resisting even symbolic changes. He would not amend the Constitution's opening line, "We the people of the Republic of Liberia and were originally inhabitants of the United States of North America." Matilda Newport Day celebrations, honoring the mythic pioneer woman who turned back an early native assault on Monrovia, would proceed as scheduled. If the defenders of the Commonwealth had lost the day in the Battle of Fort Hill, there would have been no Liberia, Tubman insisted. A day dedicated to her would appear to be most appropriate. According to Ray, he closed his ears to native pleas for a reconsideration of official Liberian history. If any native leader talked of writing a history of Liberia that celebrated the roots of Liberia's masses, Tubman chastised him for raising the specter of tribalism, a force that was roiling many new African states. And if any native leader said it was time for a new political dispensation in which the natives who made up more than 95% of the population would rule the country, Tubman went beyond mere scolding. Didiho Twe had been a thorn in the side of every Liberian administration since that of Charles King in the 1920s. A chief's son, a full-blooded Kru with a tribal cicatrix on his forehead to prove it, Twe had been born in 1879 and raised in Monrovia, on the sandy flats of Bushrod Island, in a neighborhood that would be razed and flooded, with little effort to find the displaced inhabitants new housing, to build Monrovia's first deep-water port early in Tubman's reign. Twe must have been exceptional as a youth, since at every stage in his early life there was an adult, usually foreign, eager to hoist him up another rung. After an American missionary at the exclusive Patsy Barkley private school in Monrovia took Twe under his wings, the boy was sent to Cuddington College, an Episcopalian institution deep in the interior where bright native teens and settler offspring commingled in classes dedicated to agriculture and industry. At the age of 15, Twe was sent to America, where he would remain for the next 16 years, first as a student at St. John's Academy in Vermont, and later at Columbia and Harvard, where he wrote articles for various periodicals, including one for the American Journal of Psychology. An adventurer by nature, he hitchhiked across the nation and befriended a host of luminaries, including Mark Twain, who at the time was attempting to expose the atrocities being committed in King Leopold's Congo. What the young crewman might have told Twain about the America's treatment of Liberian natives is not known. In 1910, Twe returned to Liberia. One of the best-educated men in a republic desperate for skilled and worldly diplomats, he was appointed to the commission tasked with settling the long-standing boundary dispute between Liberia and the British colony of Sierra Leone. Twe could have then taken the conventional route of the assimilated, civilized native. And in some ways he did. When invited to deliver a speech commemorating Matilda Newport Day to assembled dignitaries in Monrovia, he offered up the familiar paeans to pioneer fortitude. He credited the speech with securing him a seat in the national legislature, though later admitted that the sentiments it expressed went against his conviction. His private life followed a similar path. He set himself up as a rubber planter in the hinterland, most likely on land seized from native farmers, and married a well-connected settler woman. The former Araminta Dent had been, in fact, Tubman's first wife. Twe filled the John the Baptist role typical of early 20th century African nationalism. Instead of trying to overthrow an oppressive foreign regime, he sought to find a place for himself and those natives like him in the existing order. He spoke often about the need for the American regime to do more to civilize and uplift Liberia's tribals, and to place them in positions of power, yet this was not a radical view at the time. But once in the legislature, perhaps thinking he was now safe from persecution, Twe became an outspoken critic of the government and, in 1929, delivered a speech that helped expose the Fernando Po slavery ring. This critique would soon become acceptable but was not yet so. He was expelled from the True Whigs and the legislature within a matter of days, a year before King would be forced to resign in the wake of the scathing League of Nations report. The incoming Barkley administration was no less forgiving of Twe. Faced with an uprising among the crew, the new president called Twe and other dissident crew leaders into his office, accusing them of soliciting foreign assistance. "I will burn down the whole crew coast," Twe recalled him thundering, "if you don't stop talking about white man, white man." Twe tried to protest but, he later said, was cut off by Barkley, who sneered, "Why you damned civilized natives who ought to be leading your people are misleading them." It was only a matter of time before the government issued an arrest warrant. Twe fled to Sierra Leone, where he confirmed Barkley's worst fears by seeking arms from Europe for a war against the Americas. 6 machine guns and 500 rifles with sufficient ammunition are needed, He wrote an English friend. This is now the only obstacle in the way to free a million people from oppression. Toy's return to Monrovia in 1936 proved anticlimactic, however. Unwelcome in Freetown, as one British official remarked at the time, if he disappeared, no one would be the worse off. Toy probably had little choice but to return to his homeland, and Barclay told him he could stay if he refrained from political activity. Toy did not heed these terms, and continued his largely ineffective fight for native rights. In 1951, he hazarded a run for the presidency. He tried to start a new political organization, the United People's Party, but Tubman's factotums in the Electoral Commission would not register it, so he revived the dormant Reformation Party, garnering the support of his fellow civilized crew. He accused the Tubman administration of ineptitude and corruption, but his real complaint was about another long-standing feature of Liberian politics, the right of a president to succeed himself, which had nearly set off a civil war during Edmund Roy's presidency in the 1870s and again when the true Whig Party mobilized its forces behind the amendment of 1951 that wrote perpetual succession into the Constitution. Tubman should not have feared Toy. The post-war boom was already beginning to be felt, making Tubman a popular incumbent. And, of course, the true Whigs had not lost an election for nearly 75 years. Handsome full-color photographs of the president are on display almost everywhere, noted a New Yorker correspondent. There is a President Tubman cigar and a bobber, a native title of respect, shad beer, and during the campaign 17,000 pocket mirrors with his features in relief on the back, and thousands of red, white and blue neckties bearing his portrait, were sold. The true Whigs hired goons to break up Reformation Party meetings, confiscated funds and equipment, and arrested party officials. In public, Tubman cynically bemoaned these acts, ordering his subordinates to let Toy continue to campaign and even offering the beleaguered candidate police protection. Tubman was also willing to overlook Toy's appeal to the native constituency, usually a cardinal sin in Liberian politics. What elicited the wrath of the Tubman regime was Toy's insistence that international observers oversee the election and tally the votes. For Tubman and the settler elite, still recovering from the League of Nations inquiry, Toy's demand was an affront. In a radio broadcast to the nation, Tubman was apoplectic, accusing Toy and his running mate, Thorgs Z, whom Tubman called my inept ex-schoolmate, of treachery and sedition. Mr. Toy and Mr. Thorgs Z and their few followers, undertook to invite international intervention in the domestic affairs of this nation, the president said. They became violators of the criminal statutes of this republic and had in reason and conscience to be made to answer for their crimes. At the last minute, Tubman and the Whigs had Toy's name removed from the ballot on a technicality. The Reformation Party was allegedly late in registering its candidates. Charges of sedition were then brought against Toy and 86 of his followers. Toy fled into the bush and, with the help of crew oarsmen, across the Mono River into Sierra Leone in exile once again. He did not return to Liberia until 1960, when Tubman pardoned the paralyzed octogenarian and allowed him to die in Monrovia the following year. Toy got off relatively easily. The crowd at Centennial Pavilion on the evening of June 22, 1955, was comprised of legislators, Supreme Court justices, cabinet secretaries, and most of Liberia's diplomatic corps. Tubman sat at the head table, directly in front of the bandstand. He had commissioned the monument 8 years earlier to commemorate 100 years of Liberian independence. The building was decorated with the symbols of settler hegemony, including a 40-foot tower out front with statues of a native woman and Matilda Newport hoisting Liberia's Lone Star flags. Inside the Great Hall, a row of ebony pedestals lined the walls, topped with busts of pioneer heroes and the token tribal, King Peter, the good native leader who, back in 1822, had sold the land on which the pavilion was situated to the settlers and was then ignominiously dethroned by his own people. The crowd was there to celebrate the legislature's formal declaration of Tubman's presidential victory. After the ceremony, short films were shown, including one of the president's recent trip to Jamaica. As often happened during the wet season, the power failed. During a second outage, Inspector James Bessman, Tubman's chief security officer, noticed a pistol raised behind Tubman's back. He grabbed for it, a shot rang out, and the bullet ricocheted off a concrete beam, wounding Congressman Daniel Derricks. 2 more shots were fired, the third striking another bodyguard in the hand before cracking the mirrored ceiling above Tubman's head. As a correspondent for Time magazine reported, chaos ensued. Women in evening gowns fled, leaving their high-heeled shoes behind. Men broke for the exits, leaving not only their top hats but, in many cases, on this hot night, their tailcoats. President Tubman, unhurt and dignified as ever, did not flee. Bessman and the other bodyguards eventually wrestled Paul Dunbar, a former police marksman, to the floor. Attorney General Joseph Garber and other officials impatiently grilled the would-be assassin at one of the banquet tables. The question was put to me, Dunbar recalled later at trial, "Who sent you to assassinate the president?" "Nobody," he replied, "because I did not go there to assassinate the president." That was not what his interrogators wanted to hear. They ordered soldiers who had rushed into the hall after the shooting to drag him away. I was then carried between the executive, i.e., Centennial, Pavilion and the old executive mansion, where I was thrown down by some soldiers, with one of them having his boot on my throat, and when I was brought back to the table I had to consent to everything they asked me. He was to confess to being part of a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful people in the Republic, including the ex-president and Tubman predecessor Edwin Barkley, to kill the president and to overthrow the government. The shooting followed an election that had pitted Tubman against a breakaway group of true Whig officials and ex-cabinet members, led by the former Interior Secretary and close presidential confidant Samuel Coleman, who had quit the party a year before. Coleman had a history of antagonizing presidents. His revelations about King's involvement in the Fernando Po-slave ring persuaded the legislature to push for impeachment in 1930. 3 years later, he fell out of favor with Barkley as well, and was forced to give up chairmanship of the true Whig Party after being convicted in a conspiracy to assassinate Barkley, a conviction overturned by the Supreme Court, which cited gross irregularities on the part of the lower court as well as flagrant disregard of the law governing trials. The newly appointed Associate Justice William V. S. Tubman had written the decision. The reasons for Coleman's break from Tubman are not clear, but Tubman took it personally. In a speech in which he offered his understanding of the motives behind the assassination attempt, the president leveled what he considered the gravest political charge against his former friend, ingratitude. Despite Coleman's demonstrated incompetence, Tubman said he had repeatedly offered him opportunities to redeem himself. The so-called conspirators, for their part, called themselves the Independent True Whig Party. Recruiting an aged Barkley as their standard-bearer, they campaigned on a standard reformist platform: anti-poverty, anti-corruption, and anti-governmental incompetence. But as was always true in Liberia, policy and personality overlapped. It was said that Coleman and Barkley harbored resentments against Tubman, Coleman for being overlooked as Secretary of State and Barkley for being snubbed by Tubman at various state events. Their public stance was that Tubman was a dictator who had to be stopped in order to save the Republic. "I saw totalitarian methods of administration being adopted in public business and social relations," Barkley announced in his nomination acceptance speech. "I saw the principles of democracy being debased to immoral mob rule, and the spiritual morale of the people undermined by fear and terror of the president's Gestapo." The comparison with Nazi Germany, an instance of the characteristic hyperbole of Liberian political discourse, may have been a gross exaggeration, but it was not an outright fiction. By the mid-1950s, Tubman oversaw a network of informers and secret police, including the Orwellian public relations officers, or, as the locals referred to them, pros. The pros intimidated opponents, stifled dissent, and kept Tubman apprised of the actions and thoughts of the opposition. Inefficient and unimaginative, Tubman's security forces relied on brutality to get things done. In the months leading up to the 1955 elections, they cracked down on an increasingly marginalized but still highly vocal opposition press. The journalist Tone Ray was arrested and found guilty of contempt by an obedient legislature for writing a piece called Inside Politics, Why You Should Not Vote for Tubman. The Liberian elite observed legal niceties, Tubman's thugs in the army did not. "I was escorted to the houses of army officers to collect their toilet. These I emptied in the lavatory of the executive mansion staff," Tone recalled in a trenchant history of the Tubman administration, published 5 years after the president's death. "Before a curious crowd that morning, I was forced to put both my hands, with emphasis on the right hand, in the toilet pails to mask the excreta and stir the urine. I was then told to inhale the nasty scent and splatter feces on my cheeks and forehead." He was later beaten by NCOs and enlisted men. Tubman, a master of the art of resentment politics, portrayed himself as an outsider who challenged the Monrovia settler elite and stood up for ordinary Liberians against the reactionary old guard of the ITWP. He claimed that they opposed the open-door policy because it challenged their economic preeminence and their right to make insider deals and charge customers whatever they pleased. But what really infuriated them, Tubman insisted, was his more inclusive native policies. Those outmoded pseudo-politicians declared that the administration was giving the country away to the native man, he charged, and was promoting a group of people who had no political or social background and no claim to prominence. And Tubman always returned to the theme of personal ingratitude. He claimed to have advanced their careers, given their children scholarships to study abroad, and even increased Barclay's pension several-fold. Still, they had turned on him. The leaders of the ITWP were ingrates and backstabbers, cringingly receiving salary and enjoying other emoluments of the present administration. Similar to Barclay's Gestapo charges, Tubman's vitriol carried a truth within it. Foreign corporations and an influx of Lebanese traders, resented in Liberia and in West Africa more generally for usurping hinterland commerce and the import-export trade, were challenging the settler oligarchy, even as the latter made small fortunes renting out buildings and land, since foreigners could not own property. Many elite families, including the Barclays and Colemans, did indeed see their political influence wane under Tubman. This was not a result of the president actively recruiting native talent for his administration, however, but rather of his promotion of people on the margins of the honorable society. These men, Tubman knew, would be loyal. The campaign reached its nadir when each camp began to accuse the other of attempting to murder its candidates. At one point Coleman claimed that Tubman had supplied jeeps to certain individuals who had strict instructions from him to run over Mr. Barclay, who is in the habit of walking in the streets at night. For his part, the president asserted that Barclay had devised a plot to bomb his favorite haunt, the Saturday afternoon club. Even more bizarre was the witch doctor affair. Tubman claimed that one Megba, a Nigerian shaman, had been hired by the Barclay camp to kill him and other government officials with witchcraft. Tubman insisted his allegations were true but refused to prosecute Barclay for the reason that the Liberian government would not permit itself to go on record as believing in or giving credence to witchcraft. In the end, the true Whigs machine politics prevailed. Through intimidation and ballot box manipulation, Tubman won by 244,873 votes to 1,182, a 99% margin that the re-elected president unapologetically attributed to his administration's outstanding success. According to Tubman, the conspiracy that sent Dunbar to the Centennial Pavilion was born at that moment. The entire plot was founded, Tubman explained to the legislature in his official report on the assassination attempt, on no legitimate principle but the inordinate ambition and determination of that little group of willful, sick men of about 10 in number, to gain power by force. Tubman explained that, in the wake of their election loss, Barclay, Coleman, and the leadership of the ITWP became enraged because the people of the country had persistently and incontrovertibly expressed their vote for the present administration, while in the meantime condemning them, the ITWP, for their conduct as well as their vicious, malicious and false propaganda during the campaign. By mid-June, the cabal was allegedly meeting at Coleman's house in Monrovia and at his upriver farm in Clay Ashland, where they planned not only to assassinate Tubman and other top leaders but to burn down the government arsenal and stir up insurrection and incite rebellion against the authority of the government, though few details on these latter plans were forthcoming in the report. The conspirators then recruited Dunbar, a friend of the Coleman family, to kill the president at the pavilion. Witnesses were brought forward to say that Coleman had removed his family from Monrovia to his farm, which had been turned into a fortress the morning of the planned assassination. Others said they had seen the ITWP lawyer S. Raymond Horace wandering through the Centennial Memorial Pavilion the afternoon of the shooting, watching officials at work on the seating arrangements. In his forced confession hours after the shooting, Dunbar filled in the rest of the story. That evening, Horace had driven him out to the Coleman farm, where he was given the details of the assassination plan and a .38 caliber revolver, before being driven back to the city. Under the cover of darkness, Dunbar entered the pavilion, edged his way to within a few feet of Tubman during the movie screening, and raised the pistol. The morning after the shooting and Dunbar's confession, the police and military raced out to Coleman's farm, having already begun to round up 28 opposition party members as suspects in the conspiracy. The officer in charge knocked on Coleman's door, warrant in hand, only to be met by a shout of "I will give these bitches hell" and a volley of machine gun fire from Coleman and his eldest son, John. The official report was not entirely favorable to the government. It criticized security forces for going to the farm with little or no plan of attack. An army captain and a police private were killed in the initial skirmish, and 5 others wounded. When the Colemans shot out the tires of their vehicles, not one of which had been tactically kept out of gun range, the besieging force was faced with a decision: walk the 25 miles back to Monrovia for reinforcements. They were either out of radio contact or had no radios to begin with, or flush out the defenders. They chose to set fire to the barricaded farmhouse. It worked, but during the excitement and confusion, the 2 escaped, unscathed and fully armed. It took 4.5 days to track the Coleman men down, though they were hiding just a few miles away, on a sugarcane farm. Hopeless though their position was, The report concluded, they again opened fire on the advancing force but were shot down. Tubman was avenged, but his wrath was not yet assuaged. He had Coleman's younger son personally deliver the decomposing bodies to an army base in Monrovia, where they were put on public display. Thousands of Monrovians came to see the horrible spectacle, according to Ray. And even after they were finally turned over to the family for burial, the journalist insists, Tubman made sure that no embalmer would touch the bodies, no grave diggers would put them in the ground, no clergyman would give the rites, and few mourners would attend the funeral. Ray concluded that it was an act of barbarism unequaled in Liberian history. The trial, held in the fall of 1955, was a foregone conclusion, though every formality was followed. After being convicted by the circuit court on charges of treason, Dunbar and 7 of his co-conspirators were sentenced to be hanged, a verdict upheld 2 years later by the Supreme Court. But critics of the regime were not satisfied and pointed to the many holes in the government's version of the events. How could a marksman miss his target from 6 feet away, Ray wanted to know. Indeed, why had he even bothered to get so close? Dunbar's initial confession had clearly been coerced. Later, in the safer confines of the court, he had stated that he was in the pavilion that night simply to take shelter from the pouring rain and that, as an ex-policeman, he always carried a loaded revolver with him. Curious to see what was going on, he had taken about 15 paces into the hall when a guard noticed his gun and grabbed for it. In the tussle, the gun went off. It was all an unfortunate accident. What did that mean for the conspiracy? If what Dunbar said was true, there had been none. But even assuming that his presence at the pavilion had not been as innocent as he claimed, there was only one living witness who could credibly tie Dunbar to the ITWP leadership. Yet Soko Brown, a co-conspirator who became a state's witness in exchange for immunity, had always been on the fringes of the ITWP inner circle. He was the only one of the conspirators who had not been rounded up by police and paraded to jail in his underwear on the night of the assassination. The consensus among Liberians, then and since, is that there was no conspiracy, nor any assassination attempt. It is generally accepted that Tubman used the incident and the convictions to crack down on what little opposition to him remained. In a typically Liberian gesture of official magnanimity, he eventually granted all of the convicted conspirators, including Dunbar, a full presidential pardon. They all then issued public letters of apology and contrition, thereby achieving the harmony so valued in the tight-knit world of Americo-Liberian politics. Tubman never again faced a remotely serious challenge to his authority. In 1959, his opponent was a church organist named W.O. Davis Bright, who declared in his official platform, not being particularly opposed to the continuation in office of President Tubman, "This venture of mine is purely sportsmanlike, and is in response to the ardent desire of Dr. Tubman for fair and friendly competition." The ballot symbol Davis Bright chose to represent himself to illiterate voters was a sheep. He would receive 55 votes, including Tubman's. Even so, Tubman grew increasingly paranoid of subversion from abroad. His loathing of Kwame Nkrumah never abated, and as the Cold War intensified in Africa, he saw Soviet agents behind every ironwood tree and their alleged Liberian collaborators in university classrooms, newspaper offices, labor union halls, and diplomatic missions. Communist plots were unearthed on a regular basis, among students at the University of Liberia in 1962 and striking rubber workers at the Firestone plantation in 1966, for instance. Tubman's hand-picked ambassador to Kenya in 1968 was accused of being a communist and of treason, but his actual transgression, like that of Coleman, had been disloyalty and ingratitude to the president. In court, the government's evidence against Ambassador Henry Fonbule consisted of, among other exhibits, a pin he'd received from Mao Zedong, Chinese books he kept in his study, and the official portrait of William Tubman he failed to hang on his office wall. In his more lucid moments, Tubman recognized that the real threat to his presidency, perhaps even to the Americo-Liberian regime itself, lay not in conspiracies inspired by foreign nations but in forces he himself had unleashed. For all his repressive policies, Tubman, with revenues from the open-door policy, built the schools that introduced thousands of young natives, mixed-heritage Liberians, and poor settlers to the wider world. In an interview with a Time reporter in 1969, he admitted that the hundreds of students his government had sent to be educated at American colleges would be difficult to control once they returned. "I'm committing political suicide," he said, half-jokingly. "These boys will come back experts, and I know nothing but the Bible." What he did not acknowledge or perceive is that these students would also come back radicalized by their experiences on American college campuses, and that their ideology, not their expertise, would be the foundation of their challenge to the ruling class. He also did not foresee, dying in his London hospital bed, that it would be a barely literate master sergeant from the farthest corner of the Liberian hinterland, not an educated young Liberian, who would end a century of true Whig rule, and in the most violent way imaginable. In the end, the American-Liberian regime did not commit political suicide. It was murdered.